Let's see if Ilford Delta 3200 really is 3200. I wanted to do some more film comparisons to Tri-X like I began earlier in the year. But to keep things consistent, rather than do them every now and then, I went ahead and got 49 different film stocks, everything I could get in 35mm from B&H and Freestyle. So unless they were out of stock, I got a roll of it. Now, if this part of the video seems familiar, it's because I'm using this portion of the video for all 49 of them rather than record it 49 times. So if you want to skip ahead to the H&D curves or the prints, time codes are right over here. For those of you that haven't seen this part of the video before, here's what I've done. So I wanted to use each film with the exact same shot, which is a headshot of me with a Kodak Gray Card Plus, which happens to have a red, blue, and green patch, a cyan, magenta, yellow patch, and then a dark and a neutral flesh tone. Then, with those shots taken, I bracketed every shot in third of a stop so that we can make sure we have a negative of equal shadow density to the base target film of Tri-X. Now, the reason I use Tri-X is because it's just been around for a long time and it's a very popular film. So it's a good base film to compare everything to. Then, once everything was developed, which was developed in D-76 at stock for the manufacturer's recommended time, I printed everything on Ilford using the exact same aperture, contrast settings, developer, and everything. The only thing I changed was my exposure time, and that was to make sure that I compensated for any base fog variation from one film stock to another. Other than that, everything was left the same so that we can have a comparison of just the qualities of the film. Now there's going to be some differences in contrast, especially on the high end, and that's because the manufacturers getting their development time may not have used the same target that Kodak used for Tri-X. And that's okay. We're not looking at the overall contrast for everything. What we're really looking at is grain characteristics, tonality, how the film treats the shadows versus the highlights, that sort of thing. And we're looking at spectral sensitivity, thus the Gray Card Plus, rather than just a regular Gray Card. So we're going to go ahead and look at H&D curves, which if you saw one of my earlier videos on sensitometry, I like to use pen and paper and make my graphs. However, my wife was really ready to make sure I was done with this project. So she put everything into a spreadsheet for you all. So even though I don't like them, I want to show them to you thanks to her. Then we're going to go ahead and look at the prints side by side with the same print made from Tri-X. And from there, you can decide if you like the film and if you want to go and use it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the curves, and then we'll go to the prints. Here we have Tri-X in blue, Delta 3200 in red. The Delta 3200 has a fairly straight line. It has a smooth, graceful toe, meaning we're not going to get fantastic separation compared to, say, the T-Max films, but it's still pretty good. We have a nice graceful curve in the toe. It's a little bit more base fog, but that could just be this particular film that I developed. Yours might be lower. The rest of the film tends to have a fairly straight line, a little bit of shouldering in the top, but otherwise, I think we're going to have a good tonal separation throughout the entire scale once we get past that sloping toe. Now we do see that they cross a little bit near the top. That's probably just a slightly lower gamma or contrast index in the Delta, but that could be adjusted for in development time. So let's look at the prints and see how this bears out. All right, Delta 3200 here. Here we have our Tri-X. And we've got a few immediate differences. One, it's a little underdeveloped. We can see that our highlights didn't quite get there. The other thing I should note, this is not shot at 3200 because I bracketed my exposures. The exposure that gave me the same shadow detail was ISO 1000. So that is, I don't know, 1 2/3 stops slower than the 3200. So 3200 is pushing the film. You'll get less shadow detail, but by overdeveloping, you'll have your highlights where you want them. But the actual ISO speed is more like 1000. Some people get 800, but here with the stock D-76 to ISO standards, I got 1000. Okay, so it is a little dull compared. Clearly you can see it was near the end of the day because my hair is like, nope, I'm out. When it comes to spectral response, we're almost even, but I'm getting a little lighter red, a little darker cyan. So just a touch red sensitive. I wouldn't go near as far as to say it's like Arista 400 or some of the FOMA films or anything like that, but it is, relative to the other Delta films, a little bit more red sensitive. Not too bad. Certainly not a terrible thing, but just something to note. Overall, tonality is pretty good. I feel like looking at this, despite the slight underdevelopment, what we're getting is maybe a little more separation in the shadow tones here and here, but less separation in the highlights. This is something that I see pretty much with all Ilford films relative to Kodak. It's just how they decide they want to tweak their film response. So what we get is highlights that don't really separate through the tones here in the nose, from that bright highlight down the bridge, going into the lighted side of my cheek, whereas over here in Kodak we get a much more detailed separation there. It's just the way that it treats that part of the curve. The curve slopes overall track fairly close, but you see those deviations. What we do get is a little bit more separation in the shadow tones, and I think we're going to see that when we zoom in a little closer, that while the start and stop points are the same, how in between those are treated slightly differently. So I think we're going to see that down in here a little bit more. But let's go ahead and zoom in and see if we can take a peek at that a little closer, as well as just how the grain is different with the 1000 speed versus 400. All right, here we are zoomed in on the first section, and clearly the grain is more pronounced, as we would expect. So even though it's a T grain, it's from one of our top 2 manufacturers, it's just going to be a larger grain. That's the nature of faster films. So expect to have that grainier appearance when you are shooting small rolls and making them large. Now, as I said earlier, we might be able to see some of the shadow separation and how it's different than Kodak. So look at the differences here from the dark shadow around my ear and how it blends towards the eye socket and into the nose. Those are shadows to mid-tones and back to shadow. So you can just see the subtle differences there. We'll see if the video camera and your monitors pick that up, but there is just, it's subtle, but there is just a little bit of difference. Here on the shoulder, again, we have a really good example of the grain structure here in the background as it's put next to the shadow silhouette of my shoulder. Even though we have that larger grain, we can still see that fuzzy edge of the shirt. It is not getting lost as it's silhouetted against the background. And we can see the change of tone from shadow to mid-tone in the folds of the shirt and how that is treated a little bit differently. Here we are looking at the other shirt. It's a little dull, probably from needing a little bit more development, but overall it's still a pretty good example of the sharpness of this film. Yes, it's larger grain, but we can still clearly see the ribbing of the collar of the shirt. We can see the texture of the fabric. We can see the stitching down the shoulder. It is larger grain, but it's not obscuring that detail. When we looked at films like FOMA 400, things like that, we started to see grain that was so large that it was obscuring the detail, which I feel is not a benefit of the film. So, and if I'm incorrect from memory on the FOMA, it was at least one of the other films we looked at. Grain so large, the detail was getting blurred out. All right, let's look at the last section. And here we are on the facial features. Yes, the brightest highlights are a little bit duller. Again, a little bit longer development time would be beneficial there. But I think this really goes to show the differences between Ilford and Kodak films as a whole. And that is, we are treating these mid to highlights differently. The way that we are really getting lower contrast in these areas on the Ilford and higher contrast on the Kodak in these same subtle differences. Now bear in mind, these are printed at the same contrast of paper. Overall, we get the same contrast from dark to light. It's just these subtle areas are where we're going to really see the differences between the two. Can you mimic this from one film to the other? Maybe if you are really particular on which developer you use and your technique, you may be able to do that. And especially in printing, you could definitely print your highlights and your shadows separately, differently to make them match. But really, it's a matter of taste as to which look you prefer, as to what you want to develop, or what film you want to shoot. So I, for one, I'll admit I've always gravitated towards the tonality of Kodak, but Ilford certainly has its perks. I've shot more than my fair share of Ilford Delta 100, and it is a really good film, and I like it. But because of these differences in how the upper tones are treated versus Kodak, I've always just gone towards Kodak. That's just personal taste, but there's nothing wrong with either one. There you have Ilford Delta 3200. Coming up at some point, we'll compare this film with the T-Max 3200 from Kodak just to see the differences between the two. But until then, thank you for watching. If you'd like to help support this channel, you've got my Patreon available. You have my merchandise page available. So please do what you can to help support this channel to keep content like this coming. And we will see you next time.